Senator Bacik.
And I'd like to welcome Minister Hogan to the House. Very welcome back to the House, Minister, and particularly welcome to debate this important issue. And I'm delighted we have the opportunity in the Seanad of debating the general scheme of the bill to extend the university franchise at this early stage. I think it's really welcome change to our normal processes, and I hope we'll see plenty more of this, because it does give us a real opportunity, I think, to input and to give you our ideas about any changes or possible amendments to the legislation at this early stage. So as Senator Keane has said, and others, and indeed as you have said, this is a bill that has really been 35 years in the waiting. Because, of course, the Constitution was changed by the people in 1979, and successive governments have failed to deliver the reform that the people voted for in the intervening 3.5 decades. So I'm really delighted that we have finally got this legislation before us. And I'm particularly delighted, of course, in the wake of the referendum to maintain the Seanad, the result of which was to maintain the Seanad last October, in which I campaigned along with Democracy Matters and others to retain the Seanad. And I'm also very proud to stand here as a Trinity Senator, one of the senators elected by Dublin University graduates with an electorate of 50,000 people. And as Senator Barrett has said earlier, these are of course Irish citizens resident both in the jurisdiction of Ireland, in Northern Ireland, and indeed all over the world. I think I sent my Litteram Hokan as far afield as the Pacific Islands to at least one graduate who's an Irish citizen registered there. And just listening to Senator Mooney, I think some of his, many of his comments were very constructive in terms of the complexity of this legislation, and the complexity, I suppose, the logistical complexity of rolling out an election to such a large number of electors. I think he may need to know that we in the university seats already have the right to send a Litteram Hokan to each registered graduate, and I would hope that would be continued with the new regime. But I would suggest, Minister, that in the interests of cost, that we might, instead of having one Litteram Hokan per candidate per graduate, we should instead have one correspondence to each registered elector, which would contain on it text and photographs from each of the candidates. So you'd have one composite Litteram Hokan, and I do think that would really be very welcome. I know just from lots of correspondence from constituents, and I know the other university senators will have the same experience, that we regularly get objections from people about the amount of mail they are receiving at every Senate election. Some people actually really don't like to see the waste of, as they see it, waste of money, of state money, and indeed waste of paper. And I think we could streamline that process. I don't know what my colleagues think about that, but I think we could streamline that process without losing the democratic right to communicate with the potential electors. And when we're talking about a potential electorate of 800,000 people, I think that's really important. I'm also conscious, just again on the practical side, of the huge difficulty the current alumni offices in Trinity and in the NUI have in maintaining an up-to-date register of electors. And again, I think Senator Mooney addressed some of this very practical difficulty that we'll have with rolling out this the new legislation. I just checking my emails, I've had yet another email from a constituent saying, you've sent your newsletter to my parents' address, because of course many graduates register on graduation at their parents' address. They may move on, in fact inevitably they will move on, and change addresses over many times, and quite often never update that with the alumni offices. And I think that will be a huge difficulty in practice for the broader register of electors that will now be put in place. But all of these are mere logistical difficulties I think we can get over, and it will simply take some time to ensure that this can be done. And I know, as you've said, Minister, there will be there has already been the first meeting of the technical working group looking at these practical difficulties, and I know that all of us in the university panel will be very glad to help and give our own any observations that we might have from our own experience. I think the main point to make is that this is hugely welcome. It's very, and I'm very glad that the government is finally moving on this, and I would hope it will have cross-party support, because since I was first elected in 2007, all of the university senators, without exception, have called for this reform to be made. And there are many very obvious reasons why it's hugely important that we would make this reform, and I want to address really the merits of the bill. before just mentioning a couple of things that I think, one thing in particular that I think might change. But I would say first, just in answer to Senator Norris and some of the points he made, that this is not an attempt to capture by the political party, to capture the election of university senators by the political parties. I certainly don't see it in that context, and I don't think it should be seen in that context. And Senator Norris referred in particular to the new procedure that's going to be set out, I think, in Head 8 for the replacement candidates from a replacement list, as with the European elections. But that, that applies in the European elections to all candidates and to all elected MEPs, whether they are independent, like Marion Harkin, who is a replacement, in the same way that any political party MEP has a replacement. I think it's sensible, and again, just looking at the logistics and the cost, the potential cost of running a by-election, I think that's a sensible recommendation. What's important, of course, is that the replacement name is put out there in the public domain, so that people, when they're voting for somebody, know who their replacement will be as well. I think and that's also the case with the European elections. But I think the other point is that just because, if this was the only reform to the Seanad electoral system, it would represent a deeply disproportionate model then, where we have 6 senators elected by 800,000 people, and the remaining 43 senators elected by a very small number, just several hundred, and then, of course, 11 people just appointed. Just because that would be disproportionate doesn't mean we shouldn't welcome this reform. But of course, we shouldn't stop there in reforms. And I think Senator Keane put it well when she said this is the first step of reform, and there are already other reforms have been suggested, and I hope we will see in the lifetime of this government other reforms also, particularly to the 43 senators elected on the vocational panels and to that method of election. I'll address that in a minute. But I think it's important that this reform is welcomed in itself, and that it isn't. And I would be disappointed, I must say, if colleagues who support reform and who support increased democratisation and opening up the university seats would oppose the bill simply because they feel it might be the only reform. The merits of the bill. First, the obvious one, it will end the discrimination that currently exists against graduates of other universities and other higher education institutes. It will open up the Seanad for the first time to much larger numbers of voters, 800,000 as we've seen. There's argument about elitism in allowing only university graduates and college graduates to vote. I would say that we have in fact a very high level of participation at third level, as shown by the numbers who would be entitled to vote. The higher education institutions have made huge efforts, particularly in recent years, to increase diversity in the makeup of their student body. And of course, the final point, I suppose, is that without changing the constitution, we can't change that particular provision that requires that there would be 6 senators elected by university graduates. So I think that, in the context of the current constitutional framework, the most democratic way to deal with the 6 university senators is to ensure that we are elected by graduates of all the third level institutions. I don't see that, by the way, as abolishing the TCD brand. As a Trinity graduate, I'm sure Trinity will be well represented. I very much hope it will be, even with the new system in place, Senator Mooney. The second merit of this is that it will abolish the current rule where you can have where there are quite a number of individuals, Irish citizens, who have more than one vote for university senators. Somebody who has a degree from Trinity and a master's from UCD, for example, has 2 votes, and that's again, it just seems inequitable. Thirdly, it will improve. I think in Head 7 we see an improved nomination system, 40 people who are registered. I do have one difficulty with the nomination system, which I'll come to. I think the fourth merit of this bill is in Head 8, the replacement candidate system that I've mentioned. And in Head 5, I think something that I welcome, and I hope I'm right in my interpretation, is that Head 3 appears to reserve the rule that an Irish citizen resident outside the jurisdiction will still be entitled to vote in Seanad elections. I think that's hugely important because, as Senator Barrett has said, that does enable a large number of Irish citizens resident in Northern Ireland to have a voice and a representation in the Seanad. I would really not like to see that changed. And Head 3 currently appears to retain the current rule. It doesn't require that somebody is resident in this jurisdiction. I think that's very welcome. The one particular flaw, though, as I see it, in the current scheme of the bill, as it's currently drafted, and I hope we'll see that changed, is that is in Head 7 and subsection 7, which currently requires a €900 deposit. And just, listening to others speak about the need to ensure that financial considerations don't put off people running for election, I think it would be important that we make sure that that deposit isn't too high. I would have thought €900 is too high. I'm grateful for the Minister's officials for clarifying that the current deposit rate for the Dáil is €500. Now, I can see and I think for European Parliament, €1,800. So I can see the rationale is this is a much bigger electorate. But I'm not sure, given the status of TDs as against the status of senators, that it's justified to have a deposit that's effectively double the deposit for a Dáil election. And I would like to ask you, Minister, if you could revisit that issue. I think €900 seems to me to be excessively high as a deposit, and it may well have an effect on dissuading meritorious candidates. And it's also, of course, a huge departure from the current Seanad University panel model, where I don't believe we have a deposit system, and we simply have 10 nominees. Now, I'm all in favour of having a greater number of people who can nominate. I think 40 people is sensible. 10 is too few, I think, in the current regime. But and that shouldn't put people off running. If you can't get 40 people to nominate you, out of 800,000, then I think, that's fair enough to say that perhaps you shouldn't be considering your candidacy. But I think the €900 doesn't seem to me to be fair. But of course, the main issue with the legislation is that it shouldn't be the only reform, and it would lead to a skewed system of representation in the Seanad if it was the only reform made to the Seanad electorate in the lifetime of this government. And I'm really glad that we have already initiated a process of investigating other potential reforms. It is essential that those other reforms are essential, while this is pressed ahead with. We had a meeting, as the Minister is well aware, with the leaders of all the groups in Dáil and Seanad at the Taoiseach and Taoiseach in December. And I think, just to finish on perhaps the points that were made there, which were that those senators elected on the 5 vocational panels should also see an expansion of their electorate beyond the current very limited number of people who can vote, drawn from the councillors and sitting TDs and senators. I would like to see universal suffrage, or perhaps on a regional basis, in line with the European election constituencies. And I would like to see a further important reform that would actually reduce the potential costs associated with that, and that would be to have the elections held on the same day, and I'm conscious that the bills that have been put forward by Senators Quinn and Zappone and Senator Crown do in fact contain many of these changes: the universal suffrage principle, the timing of the election. The timing of the election on the same day, if we define postal ballot in such a way that we can do it in the polling stations alongside the general election, we then get rid of the current critique, which is that people run for the Seanad, including myself, having failed in Dáil elections, and we also reduce...
There's nothing wrong with that.
Well,
Absolutely nothing wrong with it.
I do think it's a matter of debate, and I'd be really happy to debate it further in this House. I know it's not the subject of this bill, but I think that it would at least, it would certainly resolve the issue of cost, if that's a problem, if that's an objection to having universal suffrage. I think the principle of
the house of your talents.
The principle of universal suffrage.
The house of your talents.
Thank you, Senator. I think it's something we can debate, but I think the principle of universal suffrage, if I could just end on that, is hugely important. That the 43 senators elected on the 5 vocational panels should see an expansion of the electorate commensurate with the expansion we're going to see in the university panel, which I very much welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.